Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted social inequalities around the world, and yet in some cases, national responses have also provided potential glimpses of how the gap might be narrowed. The question raised by Economist, trend analyst, and futurist Bronwyn Williams in her contribution to the book Aftershocks and Opportunities was, will 2020 be a great equaliser or a great divider? So with the year of 2020 as the baseline, I'm delighted to welcome Bronwyn to the podcast to explore the future of social separation. Bronwyn, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about your background and your work.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I'm Bronwyn Williams. I'm a partner at a company called Flux Trends. And what we do is we try and unpack trends as business strategy. So I suppose we're slightly less far ahead than some of the other people in the future space in that we do deal with trends predominantly and how they can inform the future going forward, rather than in the sort of more speculative side of futures is to sort of design where we could be headed. So our role really in the sort of business ecosystem is to help our clients understand the threats, the trends that are already in play posed to their organizations, and also then to see the opportunities so they can cash in on those opportunities ahead of the colleagues. As we like to say, we're pretty much the contemporary equivalent of the watchmen who sit on the watchtowers and medieval turrets, sort of scanning the horizons, looking for the marauding hordes and trying to buy the people who pay us just a little bit of time, which is all we can really do.
And is your, just as a bit of an aside, actually, is your sense that almost the further future is closer to us than it's ever been before, and therefore our sense of near-term uncertainty has never been so important, particularly through the current crisis?
Well, yeah, it's the difference between your enemies sort of strolling up to you on foot and then sort of coming towards you in an autonomous taxi going at like 200 or 300 kilometers an hour. I mean, they're still heading in the same sort of direction, but they are coming at us at a bit more speed and also with a bit more frequency. And that's not because humans have become more complicated or life is more difficult today or those sorts of things. It's not quite as dramatic as that. It's more because there are more of us on the planet. And that's where change comes from. It comes from people. And as our population is still increasing and going to increase at least till sort of mid-century, at which point it could actually start to reverse. But until that point comes, things are going to get more, shall we say, interesting, just due to the fact that there are more potential connections and collisions that could be taking place.
So kind of building on that theme, do you think the evidence tells us that major crises like the COVID pandemic, like the 2008-9 financial crisis, do they tend to exacerbate social and economic divide?
Yeah, they do. So what crises tend to do is two things. They tend to accelerate certain trends that are in play and they tend to slow down other ones. So the sorts of trends that were slowed down, unfortunately, over the last year have been trends towards reducing inequality, whereas the sort of trends that have sped up have been trends towards things like automation and things like bigger governments and more influence in our economies, all of which tend to accelerate inequality. And unfortunately, that was one of the first predictions that I was able to make when I saw the world going into lockdown. I thought this is really going to impact on the bottom half of the population. In fact, we can even say like the bottom 90%. And sure enough, unfortunately, this is one thing I'd have really liked to be wrong about. What we really have seen is that the divide between the bottom and the top strata in socioeconomic terms of the world's population has become much, much, much wider. It's become wider within national borders and it's become wider between nation states. It's become wider between big businesses and small businesses. And what we've essentially seen is the middle falling out of the market. We've seen the former middle class either becoming much, much richer if they were on the sort of upper tier of the middle class and sort of going to become quite wealthy, or on the other hand, falling down below that sort of strata, or as I like to describe it, because the whole term middle class is obviously quite vacuous. It means different things to different people. The way I try to describe it is that there are essentially sort of three components of any society. You've got your independently wealthy, that would be everyone from sort of trust fund kids all the way up to people who have saved for their pensions, people that essentially get to live without expending any additional energy. They can live off their savings. So they're independent income and they live by themselves for themselves. They are not dependent on the state. Then you've got your codependent class, which most people would consider to be kind of like your middle class. These are people like I'm sure yourself and definitely myself included, have to do some sort of work in order to survive. We have to earn a living, whether that's through having a job or through having clients or through selling and trading goods. We have to make our own way, but we're still sort of independent, or we are codependent on each other on the other part of that trading class. This is the class that has really driven the Industrial Revolution. It's driven progress into the middle, into the world that we're living in right now. And that is where we have people sort of rising up. So we have life getting relatively and absolutely better off due to the work of others through that active sort of strata of society. And then you have the third strata, which are the people that are dependent on others in order to survive. They are unable to work for their own sufficient need. These are the people that are falling through the cracks, people that are dependent on grants or increasingly now on helicopter money or universal basic incomes. But essentially, they are surviving at the pleasure of the state or of the other tiers of society, which is quite a dangerous place to be. And coming from South Africa, where we have the world's largest inequality problem, I think this is very, very close to home. And unfortunately, sort of over the last sort of 10, 20, 30 years, since the end of apartheid, our country certainly has been working very, very hard to reverse inequality, to bring the different strata of society closer together, to make the future more inclusive, to have more people that are able to be self-sufficient and less people that are dependent on other people. And unfortunately, what we've seen is the data came out early this year that our middle class has pretty much disappeared. It shrank from being over 7 million people wide to around 2.5 million people are only now in the middle class. And this is because the wealthier segments of that strata have either emigrated or have become even richer. They're not even part of that tier anymore. And also because on a much larger scale, a lot of people have dropped below that dependency line, unfortunately. And COVID has accelerated that, and it's reversed a lot of the gains. It's reversed equality gains between different races. It's reduced equality gains between different genders. It's reduced equality gains between simply the rich and the poor. And it's hugely devastating and hugely destabilizing from a social cohesion point of view. We know that relative position in society is just as important to social cohesion as absolute gains in living standards. And what we've seen is both being destroyed over the last year. And what's interesting to me is it's not just South Africa this has happened in, it's happened across the world. We can look at sort of those sort of hidden figures that are coming out of places like the United States, where if you look at the top line figure, household income has increased. That sounds good. It sounds like, oh, all that stimulus has worked. But once you sort of look under the lid and look at the effects on those three different tiers of society that I've described, you find that there are less people working today in the United States, and that growth is being concentrated in the hands of a few, not across the majority. So those are the sort of big picture sort of paint strokes that we can see as what's happened in society.
I mean, you mentioned bigger government early on in that response. What role in those dynamics you've described does bigger enterprise play?
Well, it goes both ways. So we've seen big getting bigger. So we've seen big government getting bigger, and we've seen big enterprise getting bigger too. There's a term known as the K-shaped recovery, and that sort of speaks to this a lot. It really speaks to the fact that we are experiencing vicious and virtuous cycles at the same time. So the rich are getting richer, the big are getting bigger, and the small are getting smaller, and the poor are getting poorer at the same time. So that divide is of course, sort of self-perpetuating. And there's many reasons for this. If you look at the sort of biggest businesses, if you want to sort of attack that piece of the puzzle right now, across the world right now, many of them are in the technology space. Many of them are in what we call the platform economy. And the platform economy are essentially market makers. They don't buy and sell their own goods. They provide space for other people to buy and sell their goods. So we can kind of see them as the digital landlords of our generation. They collect a tax, a free market, supposedly tax, but they collect a tax between a lot of the trade that the codependent classes are trying to make, which means that the more everybody else works, the harder everyone else works, they get richer. And at the same time, if everyone else gets poorer, they also get richer because smaller competitors end up falling out of the marketplace. So it's a sort of a heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation that we're seeing in the corporate space. And this, of course, is raising lots of eyebrows, and it's encouraging at the same time big government to get bigger at the same time, which is also of concern for the little guy and for that codependent class that's trying to keep the economy sort of driving at the same time. Because big government, of course, wants to dig big regulatory moats, and big regulatory moats tend to entrench competitive positions and tend to work, ironically, to the advantage of the biggest businesses in the room, who are the only ones that are able to afford to jump through all of those hoops. And of course, more recently, the Australian case study is quite interesting there, where you've got the sort of big tech versus big publisher, but the little guy, of course, is sort of forgotten in that equation. As I like to say, it's like a bully takes a little girl's doll, and then, of course, teacher comes along to the playground and takes the doll from the bully and hands it to another bully, while the little girl is still sitting there without her doll. I think that's a sort of analogy to sort of see what's happening on the world in all sorts of levels. It's Goliath versus Goliath, and the little Davids are increasingly left out of any sort of place at the table.
But perhaps a topic for another day is the kind of the dynamic of power shift between government and enterprise. But let's park that for another day. Whilst there's been a huge price to pay, do you think that the pandemic might actually accelerate some realignment of policy, whether that's from collective government guilt or enterprise guilt either? But do you think there is an opportunity to realign some of these policies that start to close the social divide?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone is looking at this. I think everyone understands what the problem is now. And if you were sort of skeptical about there being a problem this time last year, you have been proven that quite wrong. It's quite obvious that we've got a massive inequality problem that needs to be fixed. So there are many, many solutions on the table. I'm not convinced of how many of the ones that are getting the most airtime at the moment will actually end up fixing the problems rather than making them worse. Unfortunately, lots of well-intended policy and regulation tends to have unintended, sometimes opposite or even more than equal effects when it's actually rolled out. But we definitely see massive moves towards policy that is focused on more redistribution and trying to level the playing field with varying degrees of success, of course. So in terms of things like regulation, unfortunately, it can often have the opposite effect, like I was saying. But it's quite interesting to see what regulators are going to do with the technologies that have sprung up that are literally reducing inequalities at the moment. And it's quite disappointing from my side to see how regulators are working against sort of redistributive technologies rather than with them. And the great example there would, of course, be what's happening with the sort of crypto space and, and how that technology is designed for itself. However destabilizing it might be in its own right, it is quite good at redistributing allocations in the marketplace from certain players to other players. Whereas the more you try and regulate it, the more those gains end up being concentrated once again. But there are many, many ideas that are being put forward. And I think the more interesting ones are things around things like universal basic income and more progressive taxation schemes, some of which will end up being more effective than others, but they are all on the table. And we should definitely have our eyes wide open that regulation is going to be focused on reducing that divide. And it's obviously going to have a large amount of collateral damage. And hopefully the collateral damage will be more among those who can afford it and less among those who can't. But there's no guarantees at this point in time.
I wonder if some of those kind of ideas are perhaps radical enough, because sometimes when we're presented with problems, we use traditional thinking, and actually maybe we're at a situation right now where traditional thinking isn't fit for purpose, and it's actually new mindsets that are required to look for new solutions. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it, because essentially what we're doing is we're trying to use the same sort of toolkit, our same box of band-aids to fix the new problems that we have, when we actually require new sets of solutions to deal with the new problems we've developed. So using like the blunt instrument of regulation in a world that's increasingly becoming more and more unequal, which is what we're talking about today, largely due to the disruptive effects of technology, by trying to apply old laws and old thinking, like antitrust laws, are not necessarily the right sort of hammer for this sort of nail. We should rather be thinking about new forms of innovation, of innovative policy and regulation. So we actually need to be innovating in the policy regulatory space rather than being reactionary to what's going on in the private sector. And there's some sort of green shoots popping up there. I definitely encourage people listening to this to look into what Taiwan has been doing with a different way of trying to approach regulation from a more collaborative space, from a more bottom-up space rather than a top-down space, and actually using technology effectively against itself or against the worst of itself to optimize for things like finding consensus among different stakeholders in the economy rather than optimizing to create winners and losers like Australia is doing. I think that the Australian approach contrasted with the Taiwanese approach is a very, very interesting case study for how governance can change in the future. I think the biggest sort of takeaway I've had there is the idea of trying to govern problems, messy, very much accelerated by technology problems, using protocols rather than using policies. So a policy is like a rule that you apply top down, whereas a protocol can be seen more as like a sort of drop down menu. So it gives you options. So it gives you a set of rules that is more flexible to apply to a situation rather than one rule. And that allows us to mitigate a lot of the unintended consequences that come on board from trying to sort of stop things top down, especially when you don't even understand what it is that we are trying to fix, because that's, of course, part of the problem. So we understand the problem, but we have no idea whether our fixes are going to work or not. So we have to be flexible with those fixes. And there's great lessons we can learn from lockdowns and the approach to the pandemic itself, in that we're trying to apply simple solutions to complicated problems, but we find ourselves in a place where we actually don't know, even retrospectively, if the fixes we applied worked or not, because they are so complicated and so many variables in play.
I mean, some of the ideas that you were speaking about then, particularly from a Taiwanese perspective, just made me wonder, are there any cultural barriers, do you think, for example, across Western Europe, UK, US, that may prevent some of those more pragmatic approaches from coming to the fore that maybe don't exist for Taiwan and perhaps other Southeast Asian nations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, but it's a point that actually confounds me a bit, because Taiwan is a much more top-down, much more totalitarian type society than some of the Western states that you're referring to. And yet their approach to regulation has been much less top-down. So it's for me quite ironic that people in the West or more free societies are saying we can't apply this here because we're too free to do it. I think that's a terrible excuse. In fact, you have to ask why a society that is actually run on a lot of control decided to give its various different players more agency. And the reason they've done this is because actually giving people more agency actually ironically gives you more control, which points to an interesting observation in that in most cases when dealing with messy problems, the answer is not either or. The answer is a lot of and. It's a lot of seeing the best of both worlds rather than the worst of both worlds. And that sort of ties this conversation neatly right back to where we started, because a lot of the problems with inequality in the Western world or in the freer world have been exacerbated by the fact that we've essentially started applying the worst of capitalism with the worst of communism. So, you've got basically sort of free markets for the poor, but you've got sort of socialized bailouts for the rich. And that's the sort of worst of both worlds that perpetuate inequalities rather than reducing them. So why don't we turn that conversation on its head and say, what is the best that we can learn from more totalitarian, more communist-leaning ideology? And what's the best of free markets? And how do we marry those two? That's a much more productive conversation than trying to pick one with all the sort of problems that each of those worldviews very clearly brings to the table. Because let's be honest, inequality is as much of a problem in your most totalitarian states as it is amongst your most free states. That's one of the great ironies of life. And we have to look at what they're both doing wrong, discard that, and focus on what they're both getting right in terms of efficiency on the one hand, whereas freedom on the other. And how do we optimize for a middle path is probably the more productive ways to dream up, as you're saying, as futurists should be doing, new ways of approaching new problems rather than old ways applied to old problems or to new problems.
I wonder if one of the potential frameworks we might use to do that are actually the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm a big fan of the kind of almost the level playing field across a whole bunch of different issues that the Sustainable Development Goals represent. So do you think that a framework like that does address the environment at the same time as gender equality and sustainable economics and sustainable communities and so on, do you think that could represent a useful way forward to help us think about a more equitable, a more human society in the future?
Well, if it's simple enough, the problem with a lot of these things is that they become sort of like wish lists, right? And wish lists can often become not very actionable. So I think that why, or at least the parts of those sort of ideas that have gained the most traction are the ones that have been framed the best. I think a lot of good ideas have marketing problems rather than have problems in and of themselves. And I think some of the best marketing to come out over the course of the last year or two has been Kate Raworth's donut economics model, because it's such a simple heuristic. It's saying donate people fall through the cracks at the bottom and then don't eat tomorrow's lunch at the top. I mean, it's such a simple framing, right? So it's like social sustainability, don't fall below that level. Environmental sustainability, don't overshoot that level. Work within that. Now, that's a good starting point. For me, it's not enough because it's not exciting to tell people to maintain beneath a certain barrier. I mean, we've had enough lockdowns and enough living within our means and within tighter creative briefs. It's not that fun. So we need to be thinking of ways of how to grow that proverbial donut. And that's where futurists like you and I need to get involved and to say, how do we extend the whole pie, that whole proverbial donut, without overshooting those two bounds? So how do we move both those lines at the same time? That's a very exciting way to frame these sorts of ideas, but also to add a bit of hope to it, because that's what's missing from a lot of these conversations. And for me, it's very frustrating that a lot of the conversations around not having people fall through the bottom of that hole in the so-called donuts are around redistribution rather than around growth. They're actually around increasing the number of people in the dependent strata of the population rather than about increasing the people in the codependent and independent strata of the situation. Surely we want more people moving up that so-called pyramid rather than more people sort of falling down to the bottom. And the sort of futures that are exciting to me are futures where more people have more of a stake in the future rather than where more people are sort of given more handouts. I don't think that that's a particularly exciting aim to have. I mean, it might be a necessary stopgap, but it should definitely not be a utopian ideal to work towards.
So assuming these kind of conversations are almost the start point of a movement to reduce social inequality, what do you think will have changed in this type of conversation in 5 to 10 years' time?
Well, I think that will definitely depend on where in the world you are sitting, because what has definitely happened over the course of the last year or so, times of crisis, a lot of big, crazy ideas have been given oxygen to breathe, and different versions of those ideas have been adopted by different groups of politicians. So Europe has definitely latched on to the donut economics model. America's latched on to the helicopter money and universal basic income idea, which is crazy. I mean, they used to be like the freest state in the world. Now you're talking about probably one of the most socialist responses to the crisis. Contrasted again with, say, Taiwan, which is supposed to be a planned economy, but they've responded with very sort of democratic ways of dealing with complicated solutions. So it's very interesting to see these different ideas, where they're being played out and how they roll out. So people are going to have quite different experiences. We're essentially sort of building a new social contract, for better or for worse. And people are experimenting with different sort of proverbial sandboxes. And we're going to see some quite big changes. We have lived through a sort of tipping point in the secular cycles, or whatever you want to call it, right now. And we can point to various different years where we've had these sort of tipping points, like the 1989 sort of tipping point when it was sort of the end of the communist experiment. And then we sort of embarked upon the global sort of neoliberal capitalist experiment. And that seemed to be the direction everyone was pointing in. But now we get to choose a different direction. And what that sort of new contract is going to look like is going to be quite different. I do think, based on everything that I've seen, that the donut economics model is the most likely one to gain traction, in that a switch from growth to sustainability as being the buzzwords of both corporate sector and national sector seems to be what's happening. I'm not taking a view on whether that is a good thing or not, but it is a pragmatic starting point. I would like to see people adding sort of inflating the donut to that conversation too, but not necessarily through just easy money printing, because that of course doesn't inflate the donut. It just sort of shuffles things around the donut. As we know, in the real world, money is really neutral. It's just very good at distributing success, not necessarily about growing it. And unfortunately, a lot of those sort of inflationary policies where they are being experimented with are likely to exacerbate inequality in those spaces. So from my perspective, if you want to stick with that sort of donut analogy, I think that some countries are going to end up with a floor that has been raised or lowered quite a lot. So with extra inequality in the donut models and a larger gap to shift there. And other places are going to end up with a smaller donut, which is probably a smaller but more equal donut. And that's not necessarily any more stable looking ahead, because without hope and without something to look forward to, societies do tend to crumble. So for social cohesion, you can't get too much inequality, and social cohesion is essential for progress and for strength, whether you're talking about military strength or economic strength, whatever it might be. we have to make sure that we have those things in place. And you get cohesion and strength according to having a vision, a plan where you hit it, and also having a not too large degree of inequality, or at least relative privilege gradient in your society. A lot of people don't pull together. So the most successful states and nations and businesses going forward will be those that are able to redevelop that sense of social cohesion and write a social contract that works for more people. Hopefully playing with some of the ideas we've spoken about today. I think everyone's playing it slightly differently. I'm not sure what's going to work out. The sort of quite airy, inflated American donut, or the vastly smaller and more concentrated European donut model, or the Chinese model where it's very equitable and very highly planned altogether, but without much scope for freedom in that equation. So we're going to see different worldviews competing for the next age to see which one wins out over the next couple of decades.
Bronwyn, that's been absolutely extraordinary. And one of the things that is kind of whizzing around my head at the moment is how fascinating it's going to be to see these experiments run their course, and then to actually see if any changing mindsets are willing to accept the results of those experiments and try something different in their own country, their own market, their own region. Bronwyn, that's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Tell us, how can people get in touch with you and find out more about what you do?
Okay, so if you want to find me, probably easy to find me on Twitter. I'm at Bronwyn Williams. Otherwise, our company website is fluxtrends.com. Quite easy to find on both places. So definitely look me up.
Bronwyn, thank you very much indeed. And thank you everyone for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and I'll see you again very soon.